An unprecedented churning has been underway in Europe since war returned to the continent in February 2022. Europe took the onus of humanitarian aid upon itself and relied largely on the Joe Biden administration to send weapons to Ukraine. Billions of dollars in military assistance from the US, no matter how slow, has indeed kept Ukraine afloat for nearly 21 months throughout the war. For a long time, the US has been pressing European countries to shoulder military responsibility, and the reason is simple. Not many in the US are convinced of supporting an endless war in Ukraine. Military aid has finite limits, materially and temporally. As the US is gearing up for elections in November 2024, which is next year, it is unlikely that its military support for Ukraine will continue as it has under the Biden administration, regardless of who becomes the next president. A bleeding crisis in West Asia has already added burgeoning pressure on the US security assistance. In the wake of all this, the Ukraine war is likely to continue for a few more years. And European countries realize that they need to start helping Ukraine militarily, even without the US. UK has also backed Ukraine, but its support has largely complemented that of the US. However, despite announcements of increasing defense budgets and agreeing to send old and rusting weaponry to Ukraine, the bureaucracy in Brussels has spent most of its time racking its brains to rise to the occasion. While there has been considerable improvement in Europe's inertia to send heavy weaponry like tanks and stuff, particularly in the case of France and Germany, it is still not enough. So, where is this dysfunction in Europe? How come a continent that houses one of the most advanced defense industries in the world has such a paltry record of standing up for its own security promises? Perhaps the military-industrial complex in Europe is so enmeshed in trading weapons with the rest of the world that they are finding it cumbersome to agree to common practice, common standards, and common production and supply chains to help Ukraine. Several manufacturers have confessed that they are prioritizing the export market rather than scaling up production. Early this year, EU member states had agreed on a €2 billion ammunition plan that would have produced 1 million artillery shells for Ukraine. But with 2023 ending, they are still not able to produce those 1,155,000 artillery shells promised to Kyiv by spring of 24. On the other hand, Russia reportedly imported 1 million of those from North Korea since August. So back in February, while the EU was confident that its supply chains would be able to mass produce the ammunition by fast-tracking financial and permit incentives, they failed to address the structural problems of their defense industry. So how has Europe's response to these supply gaps been? The security awakening that was invoked with the much-touted Strategic Compass, a famous document of 2021, did not materialize into palpable action. That push, even though half-hearted at first, came only after President Putin ticked the European security order off balance in February 22. Corporatized governments of powerful countries like Germany have come a long way from playing safe by providing 5,000 helmets to Ukraine to grand speeches on the Zeitenwende. Europe's post-war reawakening sounded tone deaf to outsiders until major countries finally started doubling down on military assistance to Kyiv. However, that alone will not be enough. Drawing upon the objectives of the ambitious Strategic Compass, the EU leaders have had a Versailles Declaration immediately after the war. This declaration was singularly directed at fortifying the EU's defense capabilities by systematically identifying investment gaps, increasing budgets, closing shortfalls, enhancing innovation, and strengthening and developing the European Defense Industrial and Technological Base, or the EDTIB. So, to revitalize this EDTIB, member states agreed to establish the European Defense Industry Reinforcement through Common Procurement Act, EDIRPA. As recent as October 23, the member states have brought out a new regulation that stipulates a partial reimbursement from the EU budget for European states engaging in joint military purchases through a consortium. The aim is to enhance common procurement in the EU defense industry. Where other countries become relevant to this discussion is in the challenges that EDTIP, which is the Europe's defense technological base, faces in meeting the challenges and demands at the required speed and volumes. While the US is likely to get most of the contracts, the American defense industry is also under pressure due to the demands from American security assistance and the need to replenish old stocks. After all, that's what they have dug into all the time to supply to Ukraine and then to Israel. Now, coming back to Europe, that is where third-party players like Turkey and South Korea have stepped in. Seoul has secured significant contracts from Poland for K2 battle tanks and artillery ammunition. It has also entered partnerships with Romania that reiterates its readiness to contribute to the European defense market. Turkey, or Turkiye, on the other hand, is preparing larger batches of Bayraktar TB2 drones that have proved crucial in several conflicts, including the ongoing Ukraine war. So, can this be India's time to usurp? India, which has emerged as a significant defense exporter to countries like Spain, Poland and Armenia, can also exploit the window of opportunity under the latest regulation pushing for common procurement for the EU under EDRIPA through financial incentives. The EU, at least in the shorter run, will need more third-party contracts to meet the demands for its off-the-shelf procurements. India and Europe's defense relations have been on a multi-dimensional upswing lately. India has joined Europe's coordinated maritime presence in the Indo-Pacific, and Brussels has appointed a military attaché to New Delhi. Both have been significant developments in EU-India defense ties that would have seemed actually impossible until a few years ago. However, defense cooperation between the two sides is often limited to India buying equipment from Europe through strategic partnership models or joint production as stipulated under the Ministry of Defence's Defense Acquisition Procedure Guidelines. There is hardly any discussion on how India can usurp the supply vacuum in Europe for off-the-shelf common procurements in at least ammunition, soldier systems and chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear, the CBRN equipment. So what has led to this gap is the lack of evaluation in India about Europe's new structural mechanisms to revamp its defense industry. Like South Korea and Turkey, India could also step up its exports to the EU under the stated goal of the Ministry of Defense to emerge as a net defense exporter. Although we are still far from exporting Europe the defense equipment they really need. India's systems are mostly Soviet era, but India's defense industrial base is evolving fast. Therefore, potentially speaking, if India is able to jointly export to a consortium what it is selling separately to Europe by finding buyers within member states whose needs could be connected, it would be a win-win situation. Defense cooperation with the EU also entails a more thorough analysis of how export controls are evolving in the continent after the amendment of Regulation 2021/821 by Delegated Regulation 2022/699, which removed Russia as a destination from the scope of EU general export authorizations in 2022. The war in Ukraine has vindicated Europe's worst premonitions about relying solely on economic statecraft for regional integration. Whatever earlier was dismissed as alarmism has now become scathing facts of life. As the bloc staggers anxiously into the complex matrix of hard security, structural reforms are underway in the European defense industrial theatre. It can potentially usher in a new era of defense collaboration with third parties. India, with its expanding defense and diplomatic footprint in Europe, can ride this wave with a multi-pronged approach. However, whether these changes in Europe will meet the expectations of Ukraine cannot be a foregone conclusion. The war is entering a dangerous stalemate as winter sets in. I will be back to discuss that and the widening circle of geopolitical impact that follows from there, all with a keen eye on how it impacts India's national interests at large. Stay tuned.